gives me great pleasure to be leading this panel today of three dear friends and individuals who have supported our audacious undertaking of looking at Dante from all these different perspectives, thinking of Dante philosophically, thinking within psychotherapeutic practice, thinking about the edges of what we can express in terms of Dante. And there have been such juicy conversations leading up to and since our first Dante Salon, which led to our first collected volume, Dante and the Other, A Phenomenology of Love, and the gatherings since then. So let me, and I will put these in order this direction, introduce this august panel. William Franke is Professor of Comparative Literature at Vanderbilt University, holding degrees in philosophy and theology from Williams College of Oxford University and in comparative literature from UC Berkeley and Stanford. William Franke is a philosopher of the humanities with a theological vision of the traditional disciplines of liberal learning and the origin and significance of human culture. His publications include A Philosophy of the Unsayable. Franke also serves as a research fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, a senior fellow of the International Institute for Hermeneutics, and has been a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Intercultural Theology and the Study of Religion at the University of Salzburg. John Tuke, Emeritus Professor from University College London. Graduated in 1968 with a first-class degree in Italian language and literature, and in 71 with a Doctor of Philosophy on Dante and the second-generation Thomist, John of Paris, both from the University of Leeds. He was a lecturer from 72 to 76 at Birkbeck College at UCL, and from 76 to 2018, lecturer, reader, and professor of Dante studies at University College London. He is the author of several books on Dante, including, most recently, Dante, 2020, Why Dante Matters, an Intelligent Person's Guide, from 2020, together with numerous articles and reviews in the area of Dante scholarship. And last but not least, David MacLeod Black, psychoanalyst, poet, and translator, is a Scottish poet and psychoanalyst. He studied philosophy at Edinburgh and later studied Eastern religions at Lancaster. He later taught for 4 years at Chelsea School of Art in London. Black spent a year within its Findhorn, yes? Findhorn. Online was no help whatsoever for that. I even watched videos and they wouldn't say the name. Apophatic, I think. Findhorn Foundation on the Moray Firth after living in Japan. He is trained as a psychotherapist with the Westminster Pastoral Foundation and later as a psychoanalyst with the British Psychoanalytical Society, of which he was later honorary secretary and remains a fellow. Black is a published author, most recently including Psychoanalysis and Religion in the 21st Century, Competitors or Collaborators, and The Arrowmaker. And it is notable, as David says, that what qualifies him to sit at the table, amongst all the rest of that, is that for his translation of Purgatorio, he won the National Literary Translators Award in 2022. So it is a great honor to welcome these three amazing speakers and authorities on Dante for this conversation. I'm going to start with you, John, because I think with Dante, there's so much to talk about in the text that we sometimes neglect how we've come to it. So I wonder if you could share with us a story of how you first came to Dante.
Yes, I should be very brief about this because it's Dante we want to talk about and not my falling in love with my beautiful Florentine aunt. There are... The first thing with my aunt and my uncle was with the Allied forces that came up through Italy during the war, and he married a very beautiful Florentine woman, and she was my aunt, and I think I was a bit in love with her myself. And she had a beautiful spoken Italian voice. And also my first book on Dante was from a shop just around the corner from here, Dorothy Sayers' translation of the Inferno. But as we're going to discuss this afternoon, what matters most is that once Dante has, once you come into the presence of Dante, he will take hold of you, he will speak to you in constantly intensified way. over the years. And so that's my story of Dante. It is a companionship, as I'm sure it is with many of you as well. To live with Dante is to rejoice in his friendship, in his companionship, in his wisdom. And the why of that, I dare say, that we should be talking about this afternoon.
Well, I'd say that my story is much more gradual than that. Not that I'm going to draw it out, but it wasn't falling in love at first sight, as we've just heard here. I actually started with Dante on a train from Oxford to Italy. I had finished studies and had been invited by some Italians that I met in Oxford to visit them during the summer in Turin. And we were all on this train, and I had a bilingual edition of the Divine Comedy in my pocket. I think I had read somewhere that T.S. Eliot learned Italian this way. So this is how I started as well. And I also had in mind that the confluence of theology, philosophy, poetry, which were really my fortes, would be found here in Dante. So I was interested in finding about this poet, but it took me a long time, I would say, to really, and it's not over yet. I continue to discover how much, the infinite riches really in this author. But it doesn't, it's not necessarily all there immediately for me.
Interesting hearing these stories. I feel I'm, by contrast, a rather late comer to Dante. I was always kind of aware of him as I was maturing, or whatever it is one does, because I was intrigued by the sense of a poet who had invested his early love with something of Christ's significance to him and in their relationship. But it wasn't until I was actually in my 60s, that I happened to go to a party, and I was talking to someone who said, there are some rather good lectures on Dante going on at the moment at the Warburg Institute. I think you'd be interested. And so I went along to these lectures by John Took and by an Italian scholar called Alessandro Scarfi, and I was completely fascinated. What I think particularly fascinated me was the sense that whatever Dante describes, often describing something bizarre or horrific, sort of Marvel Comics kind of stuff in the Inferno, or beatific, or whatever it might be, there was always a thinking mind engaged in the experience, thinking, what does this mean for me, for my development, for what is good, what is bad, how I should live my life. And I think this interested me, and this was what caused me initially to start translating 2 or 3 of the central cantos of Purgatorio, trying to think, how is Dante's mind working here? That was the starting point, and it continued into, as Aaron has said, translating Purgatorio and subsequently, indeed, Paradiso. That's my story.
Pinsky's translation made it accessible enough to my lowbrow sensibilities that I could get through and then dig into the endnotes and start to see some of the layers. And when you see a couple of the layers, you realize the depth is far beyond our capacity. I had heard lectures, and I appreciated it. That must be important, but I had to get into it, and I needed that right translation to be able to get into it, and that was for me.
Maybe I should just, but my point was not so much about accessibility. I was able to read into it, but why would this poet be so much more than any other? I loved a lot of poets, and to make Dante the first love, that is a process that's been going on for a long time. And now he is absolutely incomparable as a thinker as well as a poet. It's all of thought and civilization. I find crystallized in Dante better than anywhere else. But I'm saying it's a long process. I had many loves that Dante didn't immediately top them all. It took a long time to really learn everything that's there in poem and in all of the other texts alongside.
If we can jump into the thick of it, how about a favorite passage? One that you find crystallizes what's going on. John?
I think that for an interpretation of Dante, this is quite important. Now, he is a poet who honors the human project. That is to say, what kind of creature that we are, the power that we have to moral, ontological self-determination. The key passage here, and I commend this to you wholeheartedly, is or one of the key passages, perhaps the key passages, is in Paradiso 7. In that canto, Dante has he raises the question of why God proceeded in the way that he did on Golgotha. Would it not have been better for him to say, no, you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have fallen, don't let this happen again? Or is there some way in which man might be invited to participate in his own becoming? Now that matters enormously, because then Dante goes on to give his solution, which is the key to, you asked for a favourite passage. This is what it is about, this passage. In Paradiso 7, Dante has a sense of the way in which Christ dying as man for man meant that God was not only lifting man up, rilevar vi, he lifted you, but enables man to participate in his own resurrection in some way, rilevar si, Paradiso 7, line 116. Never in European theology has salvation theology been developed in terms of the two clitics, the two pronouns. Rilevar vi, yes, God did that, but it made man sufficiente a rilevar si, made man sufficient to participate. How to participate? Because for Dante, we are creatures created in the likeness, in the image of God, which means that we are creatures of self-determination, of ultimate accountability. Dante, he honors the human project in that way. We are companions with the Creator in laying hold of the what might be of our existences. I find that enormously stimulating, enormously a theological emphasis which has to be taken very, very seriously within the perspective of European theology generally. So we have that, the answer to your question, to the issue you raise. I commend to you wholeheartedly. There are other passages as well in the central cantos of the Purgatorio, cantos 16 to 18, are so important for Dante's understanding of what it means to be embarked on the way of love harvesting, love gathering in the occasional to the ontological. But no, that Paradiso 7 is a remarkable essay in salvation theology, by way, I say again, of Dante's taking seriously, of his crediting the human project. We are co-creators almost, in a certain sense, in a certain degree, with God himself. So that would be one of my favorites.
William, this reminds me of your sense of poetry itself and the human undertaking of poetry and the role that it plays.
Absolutely, yes. My answer to your question is every passage, every word contains all the rest of it. But the passage that I would single out to start with, and it's so important really for my approach that you're evoking here, is in the 18th canto of the Paradiso, where Dante sees language in the heavens. It's the language of Holy Scripture. It's actually the first line, the incipit of the Book of Wisdom. Diligite justitiam, love justice, qui judicatis terram, you who rule the earth. He's addressing the princes of the earth, and it's a canto and a heaven, really, it's a heaven of justice. But there's a meta-literary process going on here where Dante is seeing words of scripture in this case, that is divine words, and of course, as John's just pointed out, the human communicates with the divine. All those words of scripture have to be humanly appropriated, but it is a self-reflexive moment where the words Dante's looking at as the object of his vision are representing also the very vehicle of that vision, the words that become divine in the Divine Comedy. So there's this process of self-reflexivity, which is our human nature, our psychological nature, to be self-reflexive beings. Of course, there's the passage where se rigira, this reflexivity of consciousness really defines the human being, and another passage in Purgatory. But this also then makes the human echo the divine, because what is divinity? Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, if not the love of one's own image, actually, and that love then being substantialized, right, in the Spirit, in the Holy Spirit. It's the very self-reflexivity that is the nature of being itself. Then is projected, onto the canvas of the heavens. Dante's using the metaphor of the divine painter in this case. It's very picturesque, an aesthetic vision, but it also then brings up all of the very deep metaphysical, intellectual problematics that run all the way through the text.
Yes, supporting that absolutely. William mentioned the Se and Se Rigira. That's a key passage as well. Dante is giving an account there of the generation in Purgatorio 25, of the generation of the human soul, the vegetative, the sensitive, and God breathes into the fetus, the vegetative fetus, the rational soul, which Dante says circles around itself. We are creatures of self-circling. We circle around the still center of our humanity and all of what might be in that humanity, the Se and Se Rigira. So I'm absolutely in agreement with that. It's a lovely passage, that.
Circling around the center, then, to my mind, echoes in the, you are at the edge, I'm at the center from...
I think there are a few sources for the idea of God being a circle whose circumference is nowhere, the center is everywhere. There's a Neoplatonic tradition that carries forward that image, and Dante does reproduce images like that.
In Vita Nuova, though, does not Amor, one of the visions, Amor is beside him and is weeping, that you're at the edge of the hub and I alone am at the center.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
And that David, passage favorite.
Yes. Well, I was thinking it steps rather nicely from 7 to 18. I'm going to claim 33, the final canto of the entire comedy, which is stunningly beautiful. And it's very, very extraordinary. It links very much with what John and William have both been saying. Because it begins, Dante by now has left behind not only Virgil, but also Beatrice. And he's met famous Christian saint St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who is a devotee of the Virgin Mary, who of course is the mother. And as a psychoanalyst, I'm interested in Dante's personal history, and his mother died when he was a small child. He never mentions the death of his mother, but I think it absolutely pervades the comedy and the intense feeling he has for Beatrice. But now he's lost even Beatrice. She's gone back to her function in paradise of praising God. And St. Bernard is praising the Virgin Mary, the mother. And the final canto begins with this miraculously beautiful prayer that St. Bernard speaks, which includes the celebrated phrase "Figlia del tuo figlio," the daughter of your son, which doesn't work quite so well in English as it does in Italian, but it very much picks up the regira quality that William was talking about. The reciprocity of the relationship between the human and the divine is what this is all about. And I think if we translate that into modern psychological terms, it's the question that we are confronted with at the moment, that we are so good at the objective understanding of the world. The development of science is absolutely astounding, obviously. But what we simply do not understand is how the subjective fits into it. Neuroscientists, of course, say that consciousness is produced by neuronal activity, but we don't know that. The ultimate reality is a complete mystery to us, just as it was to Dante. But Dante has a way of talking about it because he has the Christian myth to give him vocabulary and give him terms to discuss it in. And that's what he's doing right through the comedy. But above all, I think it crystallizes in the final canto, which moves on from St. Bernard's prayer to Dante himself having a vision of precisely the Trinity in the form of 3 circles, and he's stuck by the problem, which I think is exactly the problem we talk about when we talk about the problem of consciousness or subjectivity. Now, how on earth does one of these circles have a human quality to it? And obviously he's talking about the mystery of the incarnation in Christian language. But how can it be that something objective can have a subjective quality? And he simply doesn't have the mental equipment to do it. He says, I'm like a geometer who's required to square the circle. I haven't got the kit to do it intellectually. And at that moment, which is the very end of the canto, the very final sentence, suddenly all the allegory drops away. And he has an experience, the experience of discovering that his desire and his will are moved by the sun, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. It's the most extraordinary transformation at the very end of the canto, and it's quite quiet, but enormously powerful.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. When I think about trying to find a passage or a canto to make the case for Dante, I find myself going back to Canto 13 of Inferno. The complexity of what he's doing still allows us to convey just the pathos. This is the place where those who have taken their own life find themselves. And he's engaging in layer upon layer. It begins with a series of negations. He doesn't say what it is, he says what it's not. And then later in it, he has this tongue twister around belief, creo credesce or something to that effect, to hint to us, this is about belief and conviction. And then this metaphor of the thorn bushes. The soul has been turned into a thorn bush, and when it's brushed by, it breaks off in agony, and the sap that comes forth is the blood of the person, and the blood speaks. And there's just this searing insight into the bleak, dark landscape of the logic of suicide.
When subjectivity is lost and turns completely objective, right, becoming these things, right, the human soul now is become literally a bush and branches and blood, and it's a complete reification of that dimension of subjectivity, which comes back alive, however, at the end in Paradiso 33, where Dante he uses that Christian myth, as you say, to climb up to the point where he no longer has the mental intellectual equipment to be able to intelligibly digest what he experiences. He has to go really to the limits of possibility, and the myth no longer functions really. he goes beyond that. He's thunderstruck is the image, right? It's being struck by thunder, but then he's rotating, as you say, with the love that created the stars and the whole universe. There really is a step beyond consciousness, and between subjectivity and objectivity, somehow or other, there has been this revelation that then becomes the origin for the whole poem. Everything he writes comes out of that final experience. It's the beginning, actually, of the poem at the end.
And at the end of Vida Nuova, he says, I can't express this. I'll have to develop the skills to express this. And then the Commedia becomes the expression thereof. That at the end, he's at threat of saying, oh, again, I've run out. Nope. And there's that transhuman, transcendent moment at the very end.
Yes, but what we have to say that there is that's fine, but there is a complicated existential drama leading up in all Dante's work, the major works, leading to that point of transcendence. In the Vita Nova, at the very beginning, the first, the great work of Dante's youth, there is the notion that, I conceive love as a receiving of the greeting, but Beatrice denied my greeting and I was in turmoil. And so there is a rethinking of love as praise, as transcendence. Then we come to the Convivio, in which Dante is writing for his patria, his compatriots, and they're going to be brought on in the way of the love of wisdom, as distinct from the occasional loves which can interfere or perhaps waylay that. The difficulty, what I'm saying is, all Dante's works has to do with the problematics and the resolution of being in a transcendent fashion. And then when we come to the Commedia, Dante himself is on the journey there, and he sees and understands in himself the difficulty, the self-betrayal, the self-denial, the difficulties of his own humanity and the difficulties of humanity in general, but then moves on to what we've been saying here, to this moment of resolution. He is one of the most splendid things about Dante is the emergence, but it is an adult discourse. It's a discourse which presupposes difficulty, the difficulty of laying hold of self in one's infernalità, its purgatorialità, and then ultimately the emergence of self, the transhumanization of self in the Paradiso. So yes, I would go along absolutely with this wonderful account of emergence. But Dante explores the idea in terms of the problematics of existence, and he was able to do that because his own existence was quite problematic. He knew what it was to lose self, and eventually, and perhaps in the self-same moment almost, by grace, to find self.
Which I think is a lovely bridge. David, if you could think for us, where do you see the clinical impact? What are the passages that you find perhaps instructive or at least deeply descriptive? Or?
Yes. Clinical impact is sort of difficult to talk about because I suppose clinically one waits for the patient to speak and one doesn't know which of one's own ideas may or may not be relevant to what they come up with. I thought of a couple of things I would want to say. One is simply the importance of allegory, because it seems to me we've moved massively in our thinking now in the direction of literal mindedness. And I mean, I found myself saying a few days ago that all the religions have diminished in quality, it seems to me, over the last 100 years, let's say, because they've moved in the direction of a literal understanding of their story. So you get, a lot of fundamentalist thinking in Christianity, you get Zionism in Judaism, you get the various extremisms in Islam, you get Hindutva in Hinduism. They're all narrowing down the thinking that their religions do also, of course, contain, which is allegorical and always open to the future. And the essence of allegorical thinking is that it's it's a way of thinking that takes issues very seriously indeed, but it acknowledges that there's always further to go. There's always something that one hasn't yet got into words, and actually one never will quite get it into words, but one might do just a little bit better. So it's got that sort of leading onward feeling, which I think, again, if you read the Divine Comedy, you feel it happening. It is drawing Dante ever further towards the paradisal experience. And psychoanalysis obviously got off to my mind, a slightly bad start in relation to religion, because Freud, who was so open to dream imagery having more and more meanings, and indeed says that the dream has a navel, as he put it, a belly button, so to speak, that you can never quite reach, but you can, by your associations, you can get further and further towards your meaning of your own existence, so to speak. But when he comes to religion, he becomes completely literal-minded about it. He says that religious people literally believe that, Jesus was the son of a virgin or whatever it is. And this is manifest nonsense, as we all know, because we are sensible scientists. And so religion is a sort of second-rate way of thinking, which we have to leave behind. And this, I think, is a complete misunderstanding of what allegory gives us access to. And I think many of the catastrophes that currently threaten our world are to do with this inability to take the ethical reality of allegorical understanding with the seriousness it deserves. We prefer to talk about technology or economy or whatever, but these things are instrumental. They are means to an end, but we have no way of talking, for the most part, about the actual end, the actual goal of human life. Anyway, I've not spoken enough, but that's sort of thinking.
And a theme that actually is weaving through what many of us are saying.
No, I was just going to say that it's not just religion. What you're describing, this narrowing down, this literalization, and you go through some world religions there, that's the nature of our culture today, as you're bringing out now at the end as well, the technologization of our whole culture is losing sight then of what we could call an allegorical dimension, but it's not confined to religion at all. It's culture per se is about symbolic meaning, right, which has now been erased in so many ways, because of so many forces that really, I think the super development of technology, which you also evoked, has imposed on our thinking. And now thinking is going to be taken over by AI as well.
Thank goodness I don't have to think. How I learned to stop worrying and love the AI. The rhythm of of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, that the gates of Dis midway down are the gates to Purgatory, that the parallel action, the idea that this same thing which is so dark and entrapping can be taken up differently through the process, through the enduring, through the journey, and that I can come to it again in this different way. And that rhythm has impressed me, and it's something that as I keep looking at the layers of it, there's so much woven into the fabric. As you say, we never exhaust it. It just keeps giving more and more. William, something that you wanted to make sure that we had time to think about, and I feel like we're bridging to it very nicely, is this question of thus why? What do we do? What is this relevance today of Dante, given these struggles that we're speaking to?
Yeah, but it's come out in the last remarks here, starting from David. Dante is, I think, more relevant than he's ever been before in our current crisis in the world, with the climate of animosity in politics. It's almost becoming impossible really to carry on a dialogue respectfully with people who disagree with you. But Dante experienced this, right? Guelphs and Ghibellines, black and white, they further fragmented into factions that have no understanding. They are warring with each other. This is what's happening to us in our polity today across the world. You know, Democrats and Republicans, Rassemblée Nationale, Frontière Populaire, the Front Populaire in France, or we've got the Alternative for Deutschland. Political discourse is being poisoned, and it's no longer an exchange, really, to seek the truth that all share in common, where we correct one another. I think that Dante really sheds light on this predicament into which we've been sliding. You read the Inferno.
The first image Inferno of all the flags, and it's the largest circle of hell. Right? Yes. The most capacious circle is a bunch of people chasing after different banners in a complete bedlam.
Right. So, Dante then also really has sort of an answer as to how can we reconstitute some sort of a common being, a common interest, and it does have to do with what could be put under this label of allegory, thinking otherwise, saying otherwise. It's a sensibility for the other that's in us, that connects us with all others, rather than just looking at positive units, individual, discrete units with their identities, which are always defined exclusively, right, in oppositional terms. That's really what our politics has become. And as I say, Dante had a horrific experience of that, but he kept always in view the transcendent dimension that we all participate in. You don't really even have to believe in any myth. We share a common world. I mean, there's also this dimension of globalization, which means that our nation-state system cannot deal with the problems that we face with climate change and even war. So Dante's vision was one, there has to be a world government, right? This is how he thought of it. And there's certainly something right about that. We have to be able to adjudicate our differences without going to war and trying to crush and eliminate the enemy, who is really not an enemy, if you want to understand the common basis that we all have, the common stake that we all have in this one planet, Earth. Now, another crucial aspect of Dante's thinking on all of this is he does separate religion and politics. He separates them in order to harmonize them. This is in the monarchy, and it goes all the way through Dante, through the Commedia. Pope and emperor are independent. They both have a direct legitimation from God, right? This is reversing a certain medieval system that, the Pope, one of the popes at Dante's time, Boniface VIII, had said, no, the emperor is under my authority, right? I'm the spiritual authority is higher than secular authority. Dante does really distinguish and note that the secular authority is independent of the spiritual authority of the Pope. That seems to be it is a powerful step in the direction of secularization. And Dante is a secular thinker, but it's not the secularism that leads to Machiavelli, where religion is totally irrelevant. We just have to calculate pragmatically the political stakes without any ethical or religious sense. And this is really the situation that we've landed in now in our contemporary world. You have to be able to keep value, human value, religious value, communicating with the other. Once again, it's our infinite openness to one another, which is lost in the kind of political discourse and the digitalized thinking that is now dominating, as opposed to the poetic thinking that Dante proposed. Not just Dante, he's the summation of all of ancient medieval tradition. He's also the foundation for all of modernity. He does really open up this secular space, but it's a secularization which is the realization of this dimension of the infinite, where the human is divine, rather than its elimination, its erasure, which then disconnects us from one another.
So that foreclosing that Inferno is so fraught with, that I refuse to, and it's more of, the deeper we get, the more it's a tenacious, it's not just, oh, I couldn't overcome this, it's that I refuse to, that digging down with the ultimate metaphor at the base of it, a frozen Lucifer. In all his efforts, he's all the more stuck. So this foreclosing that Inferno represents, instead of what a clinician would, I think, invite us to, that we have to go through. We have to endure. We have to create that space, the poetics that will allow us to go through, not to skip, but to actually have to go through it, and that we can companion each other, whether it is through mentoring, through poetry, through analysis, that ability to go through. I think that just so impresses me.
I think I would take a different line on that. I understand this notion of the other and the relationship between self and the other. That is very strong in Dante. Dante, you can always tell when Dante is at his most engaged because he makes up his own words. And he makes up at a certain point in the Paradiso, in miare, in luiare, in tuare, I am in you as much as you are in me. And that is very profound indeed. But your question was, so why does Dante matter? What is the relevance of Dante? In addition to this, Dante and othering, I would say that the relevance of this and the importance of this is that Dante always brings the individual into his or her own presence. It is not so much a question of othering, it's a question of self-encounter, not of the social encounter, but of the self-encounter. And that is open to demonstration all the way through. In the Inferno, what have we got? We've got God's anger, God's angry, God's ira. Dante refers to that on several occasions. But the Inferno has not got anything to do with God clapping his hands and saying, gotcha now, mate. Because if that were the case, you and I would say, very good, what's next on the television? No. It has who is punishing whom in the Inferno. On reflection, it is the souls themselves. They know that they have delivered themselves. They stand in their own company. That's take Inferno 5. Francesca says, oh, amor conduce noi ad una morte. Love brought us into this situation here. Love is entirely responsible. She's doing what everyone does in hell, blame someone else, not my fault, someone else's fault. And Dante says, ma dimmi. Where Dante says, ma dimmi, you can always be sure that something drastic is coming. How was it with you in the moment of self-betrayal? And she has nowhere to look then, but into her own, in the depths of her own personality, how it was in that moment of betrayal. In the Purgatorio, what have we got? We have got, in a certain sense, in keeping with the theology of the Purgatorio, a paying off of the reatus poenae, making satisfaction. Fine, Dante mentions that. He uses the term soddisfare quite frequently. But it's not to do with that. The Purgatorio fundamentally has to do with the taking of guilt into self, as the souls at the beginning of the Purgatorio do. My sins were horrible, and it has to do with the difficulty, the profound difficulty of love gathering, of bringing home occasional love to what actually and ultimately matters about it. Here again, it's a question of self-confrontation. I struggle to bring home the diversity of my loving to what actually matters about it. When we come into the Paradiso, what have we got? We have got, a rewarding, a grace which is poured out from above. Of course, it's by grace. Everything is by grace there. But again, you have to look deeply into it. It has to do, as Dante makes clear from the beginning, of the redimensioning of self, ridimensionare. We don't have that word in English, but it sounds redimensioning, good word in Italian, a reperspectivization of self, an opening out of self on what might be. Again, it has to do with the self-encounter, the self-losing, the struggle to find self, to lay hold of self in a love perspective, a love substantiality, purgatorio, and a love emergence. That's where the Paradiso finishes, the love which moves the sun and the other stars, and that becomes a paradigm of consciousness. So in reply to the question of why does Dante matter, I would say yes, othering is important. All of this, it certainly is. And the souls in Purgatorio, they sing with one another. No one does any singing with each other in hell. In the Purgatorio, they are singing from the very beginning. In the Paradiso, they take care of each other, they look to each other, they honor difference. Yes. But more fundamentally still, it seems to me, it has to do with the difficulty, the agony, and the ecstasy of self-encountering. Hell, purgatory, and paradise as the stages that we go through in the laying hold of self. It is very, very powerful in that sense.
Well said, and this is reminding me, before we move to you, David, on this question, at the gates of purgatory, the keys and the knocking on the gates, as that the knock first, then the keys. I'm forgetting. See, I think we knock first. Right. He comes up to the gates, and he needs to open the gates of purgatory. And instead of knocking on the gates, he knocks on his own chest, imitating the mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. But at the same time, it's this opening that must happen. I must open up my heart. And then when the keys are presented of the gold and the silver, the gold, God's grace, comes easily. This key turns easily. And then the silver key, the more psyche, the lunar, the more internal. This one, not so much. This is the harder opening up into that self-journey. So, indeed. David, thoughts on this question?
Well, I feel my two colleagues here have spoken very eloquently about it. I mean, the only thing that occurs to me to add, so to speak, is that I think this self-encounter is made tolerable, as it were, by the love of another. I think, and this of course is speaking out of psychoanalysis as well as Dante at this point, but I think the crisis for Dante, assuming that it is the death of his mother when he was a small child that is behind all this, is that the approach to love later on is intensely complicated because it's longed for, and yet at the same time it threatens memories of terrible traumatic experience of loss and rage and bewilderment at what's happened, all the suffering that children go through when they suffer this kind of loss. And so to have encountered Beatrice, who he met first at the age of 8, and then to have nurtured her in his own mind, at least, we don't obviously know enough about the objective relationship, but to have nurtured her into being this intensely loving figure that he finally encounters as he's moving through the comedy. And she starts the action of the comedy, so to speak, because it all begins with Dante lost in his dark wood, completely frightened out of his mind by his state. And then he sees Virgil, and Virgil leads him on his journey, and so it goes on. But Virgil is there because the Virgin Mary has spoken to St. Lucy, who has spoken to Beatrice up there in paradise, and Beatrice has descended from paradise and come right down into limbo to speak to Virgil and say, please go to the help of my friend Dante, who is in crisis. And Virgil immediately goes and serves her. So from somewhere, Dante has managed to retain, despite the loss of his mother, has managed to retain the sense of a loving force that wants him to do well, as it were, wants him to make something of his life. So anyway, I'm really trying to put together the idea of the importance of the other, but self-encounter that John speaks of.
There's the sense of self is so overweening in Dante. Every work by Dante is autobiographical in all sorts of ways. The Commedia, really, it's all about Dante's self, and really maybe the first European individual self coming into emergence. At the same time, the self, how does Dante establish the self? It's through the relation with Beatrice to start with, right? That other, the other becomes all important, really, for him coming to his sense of self, and then it's the divine other that Beatrice really opens him to. It's our relations to others that enable us to come to ourselves, to recognize,
To me retrova.
yes, to
And
find
you can express that theologically, because one of the most beautiful things about that is that companionship, the next person in Dante, is a means of grace. Virgil is there because he's commissioned from on high by Maria, Lucia, Beatrice, and at the beginning of the Purgatorio, he insists on that. Beatrice is there as a means of grace. How beautiful is that? In hell, no one is a means of grace to anyone else because they are so radically, drastically self-centered. But with an adult humanity, and I take absolutely this sense of othering in this sense. In an adult humanity, the next person is present to self as that whereby he or she is graced. And that is very, very strong in Dante. In addition to this struggle with self, we have in the Purgatorio, in the Paradiso, this blessedness of companionship.
I'm mindful that we've brought up so much in just this conversation. I could not have wished for better conversation companions. Mine, Virgil's. I would like to open it up to the floor because many of you, I would like to extend this opportunity I have been jealously looking forward to actually be in conversation with the three of you. Thank you very, very much. Please, thoughts, reflections, questions for our conversationalists here. Yes.
You kind of mentioned religion as you were talking about Dante, but I was wondering because a lot of his work does have to do with kind of the connection between the individual and the divine, and so I was wondering how one would interpret that from a more secular perspective, especially the passages that kind of heavily incorporate that connection and between man and God.
I think of Denby in Great Books. He goes to great lengths talking about all these other works that he can relate to, and then he gives, I think, a page and a half to Dante saying, I just couldn't get past all the visceral stuff and the religious themes. It's like, oh.
Yeah. Okay, well, there's this, there's the Christian myth, as David mentioned, and there's a lot of dogmatic theology in Dante, which can be an obstacle. It doesn't have to be. And that's what we want to try and say, I think, in answer to this question. If you take it, mythos is story. Everyone has their story. The truth is something else that's not said per se. That really escapes. The narrative is a means toward unveiling something else. And Dante, it's become very cross-cultural, I have to say, in recent times. Dante and East Asian Buddhism is one of the, but, Dante and everything else. You don't have to get stuck with the dogmatic religion. These are allegorical images for the relation of the human being to itself. And what is a human being? In any case, we don't know that. That is a mystery. It's we could call it a theological mystery as much as a psychological mystery. That is theology, the discourse of theology, like the discourse of psychology, are ways of trying to understand this mystery that Dante opens up in terms of his Catholic myth of his age. But he also really puts that myth into question in all sorts of ways. It's very interesting looking at the other cultures, the Jews going to laugh at the Christian hypocrites being punished, and the Persian as well, and the Hindu on the other banks of the Ganges. Dante invokes these extra-European perspectives in order to put into, this one myth that he uses, that's his scaffolding. It's just a means in order to open up to the infinite, to a dimension of the infinite that can be interpreted in terms of all different cultures.
I don't know if any of you have watched anime from the last 20 or so years, but seeing Western Roman Catholicism through the eyes of a Japanese animator is a fascinating experience. The imagery gets all twisted about, and you go, where the hell did they get that? And I think we lose sight because we're not reading a lot of Dante's contemporaries. Dante is playing with religion as his palette, but he stretches doctrine in many, many cases and goes well beyond his source texts, if you will, and with his imagination.
Actually, he shows doctrine itself to be really an attempt to grasp something that is ungraspable and unsayable. So, the doctrine shouldn't be shutting down and saying, what? No, it's open, allegory, and it's really speaking to this other that informs all of us. It's between us, it's in us, that enables us to relate to one another.
Open up to the floor again. Other questions, thoughts, reflections on what we've brought up today? We have a little more time. Yes?
What's the significance of him writing in Italian as opposed to Latin, which I presume is the theological language of the day?
John, do you want to take that one up?
Well, a brief answer, only the beginning of an answer, because that's an excellent question. Dante wrote in Italian. He wrote one or two works in Latin, theoretical works in Latin, the De Vulgari Eloquentia and Monarchia. But the beginning of an answer would be that Dante was committed to the notion of language, and this is there in the De Vulgari Eloquentia and implicitly in the Commedia, as the form of our humanity. And there is a strong commitment, both implicitly and explicitly, to the vernacular as the language which we learn from childhood, as he says at the beginning of the De Vulgari Eloquentia. So what I'm saying to you is that Dante takes very, very seriously the notion of vernacularity and of the power of and he interrogates the Italian language in the poets that he knew, Guinizelli, Cavalcanti. There is a stringent process of interrogation of the power of the vernacular to express exactly, not Latin in its cultural a priorism, its cultural dignity. No, the vernacular is so precious to Dante. It is sacred in its function as the form of human experience. And this comes through explicitly in the Purgatorio, as well as in the the first and the second book of the De Vulgari Eloquentia on vernacular eloquence. It is really a plea, a testimony to the importance, the indispensability, and I say again, the sacredness of the vernacular as the form of our humanity? So that's an excellent question, that is, because that touches on something which is a systematic, a very carefully thought through issue in Dante's own mind, the vernacularity of our humanity.
Could I just add one thing? At one point he says, I owe my own existence to the vernacular because that was the language in which my father wooed my mother.
And actually, it's the choice of a language that was not recognized as sacred. Latin was a sacred language like Hebrew and like Greek, the Greek New Testament. Dante's writing in the vulgar tongue. I agree absolutely that it sacralizes language. Language as a natural expression of self. It's what you think in, and it's evolving. Unlike the Latin, which has a certain kind of perfection to it, but it's this openness towards discovery of oneself in relation to others that is possible in the vernacular, in this living language, in a way that was no longer really possible in the language of learning and the sacred language of the Latin Vulgate. But I think that choice is part and parcel of the opening to one another and to all that I'm trying to underline.
And that comes over explicitly in the Convivio. At the beginning of the Convivio, a philosophical work in Italian, he says, I am writing for the benefit of those companions of mine, compatriots, who are underprivileged. I'm going to bring them on in the way of the love of philosophy by means of the Italian vernacular. It is of the essence. As I say again, that's an excellent question.
And it's in that specificity of his experience, and only a language that allows him to stretch down to the depths, that he can tell the story that he tells. Other thoughts and realizations and questions that come up for you, please.
Can I lower the tone, the discussion a bit? One of the problems I have is the thought of Mrs. Alighieri living with Dante, in love with this eight-year-old Beatrice. It's a bit tough, I think, for women.
Well, for Gemma.
Yes, I mean, his idealised women, and his wife, who stood by him all the time. I don't know what observations you four men have about.
Let me set you up just a touch more.
I think the beginning of an answer to that lies, and you have to have a leap of imagination here. There's a letterarietà, a literary preoccupation. Gemma must have been indeed a very, very patient woman. She was left behind in Florence during the exile. I think, as I say, the beginning of an answer there is that Dante is proceeding in a literary tradition. It is a different kind of discourse, a different area, a different, what can you say? It's a literary paradigm. That's why I say letterarietà. Going back through the Scuola Siciliana, right the way back to the Provençal poets, always Madonna was there as an object of celebration. And it's exquisitely literary in character, and so you need a leap of imagination that may justify or lay your fears and anxieties a little bit.
And does his journey, in fact, perhaps show that getting over it is probably the wrong turn of phrase, but he is transformed by the end of it, from someone who I think perhaps we might have worried about, till by the end, oh, this is lovely and transcendent. And we'd like to think Dante could love her all the better for the man he became by the end of the Commedia.
The evidence, I think, is that Gemma Donat was one of Dante's in Florence. Evidently, she supported him, in his exile. There's not very much evidence, but I think the people that have reconstructed it, you would have thought she would not want to have anything to do with him, but it seems to be the opposite, that she was really, reliable for him, that she did not take it as eclipsing her. They had their relationship, whatever it was. This is on Dante's literary fantasy on an ideal plane, is expressing something else that does not interfere with his human engagement with his wife.
And probably worth saying as an addendum to that, it doesn't address that question, but it's an addendum to the two of the most gracious figures, most sublime figures in the Divina Commedia are the female characters of Francesca, who is so gracious in Dante's reception, and Dante delights in her company and swoons at the end of that canto. And as a companion piece to that, the exquisite third canto of the Paradiso, which is the canto of Picarda Donati. And again, she is such a beautiful presence. So the two key figures of grace there are female figures.
Also interesting, though I don't know whether it proves anything very much, but Dante and Gemma had 3 children, and all 3, 2 boys and a girl, and all 3 of them joined Dante in Ravenna at the end of his life. And the girl, I don't know what you'll think of this, became a nun and took the name of Ser Beatrice, Sister Beatrice.
Yes.
This is less a question than something I just kept thinking. This is a wonderful discussion, first of all. It was just so lovely to hear you talk so personally about your experience with Dante on this kind of level. So thank you, Aaron, really, for setting this up like this. One of the things that occurred to me, and this also relates maybe to your question too in a minute, is this idea, it's been a long time since I read it, so I may get the names wrong, not to mention where they fall. But I think Francis tells Dominic's story and Dominic tells Francis' story. Am I right on that? Or Benedict?
Yes.
Almost. I'm somewhere close, right? But they're sort of telling each other's stories from different tribes. And
It's orders, right?
Say again?
Yeah, St. Thomas Aquinas tells the story of St. Francis, and then Bonaventure, because of the other, he's a Dominican.
That's
And
it.
then it's the Franciscan Bonaventure who tells the story of St. Dominic.
Yeah, that was it. And I knew I
Right.
wouldn't get it
Yes.
quite right, but this part I got. And I guess I was thinking that that's so relevant right now to where we aren't. And so I just wanted to add that to the discussion. And I guess the other thing is, I know you over there who asked about the Christological part. Psychoanalytic jargon is so difficult to get through. Object relations, what is that? So you think that in a certain way, we have to get beyond the kind of language that we all understand beautifully when we're in it to really be able to see what's behind it. And I guess I'm not saying anything that you didn't say, but I guess I just wanted to pull in how complicated our language can be for people who aren't in the field. And what do we do about that? I mean, Dante really had a way of getting behind his language. We don't yet. And I think that's one of the things that Psychology and the Other is really trying to do by bringing all this together. That's what I want to say.
As John notes, when he couldn't get beyond the language, he just made up a new word, which psychodynamic and postmodern writers relish.
That's less helpful.
I was going back to the perversity. Other thoughts and questions as we near the end of this delightful moment?
There is quite a lot to say about that. You mentioned the point about Bonaventure and the exchange of pulpits almost at that point. That Dante was, in a certain sense, his spirituality was a complex spirituality. He cherished the Franciscan way for its integrity and the Neo-Aristotelian way for its care and commitment to the possibility of thinking things through. So both have an important part to play in a complex spirituality, a very rich spirituality.
It's really beautiful, and so it doesn't become so tribal. You can take something from each of them and combine them like that.
By the end, yes. But at the beginning, we're all biting each other's backs.
But in that moment, is that in Paradiso then?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the heaven of the sun. And then each of those saints speaking actually has a diatribe against their own order. They criticize their own order while exalting the founder of the other order.
It's so beautiful.
Alexandra?
This might not be so great a question, but Dante chose to write the Divine Comedy from his perspective as sort of his story, when he could have easily have done it from maybe a third person point of view or some other character. This isn't so much a question, it's more like a reflection on that and how that could have changed the interpretation of the story.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's an excellent question as well. It's written in the first person, and that enters into the interpretation of the text. Everything in Dante has, as I said a moment ago, to do with the development and the problematics of selfhood and the resolution of the difficulties that we have, particularly, not so much cognitive, but affective problematics, the gathering of love. Dante knew himself. He stood in his own, he circled around the still center of his own presence. And that accounts for his procedure there and also points to the way in which we are to understand that text. The text has to be understood not, therefore, as a sort of a pure imagination of how it's going to be when we get there. No, it has everything to do with the working out of selfhood, and it's that procedure is confirmed and vindicated by Dante's proceeding in the first person. I, Alighieri, found myself in a dark wood. That is where we begin, with self and the obscurity of self. So that's a very good question.
And there's that great arc of Dante the poet, Dante the narrator, Dante the journeyer, and the eventual alignment of them all, the fawning obsequiousness with which he approaches Virgil. Oh, great poet. And eventually Virgil says, knock it off, you know the answer to this. And then by the end, Dante himself has been prepared to receive his projections, if you will. And that terrible, almost punchline to a joke where it's 2 cantos before he notices that Virgil is gone.
I thought also another important nuance in this question. Actually, the first verse, there is not the I, to tell you the truth. The mi ritrovai, I believe, is the second verse, first sentence. But nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, it's our life, right? It's the first person plural, comes up before the actual I instance. So, there is that dimension of otherness, actually, of, within the self itself being a plurality.
Yes, I was going to make a point somewhat similar to that curiously enough, by using the word I, Dante universalizes the story, because we are all I to ourselves. Whereas if he told it about someone in the third person, it would just be someone in the third person to everybody. So it's paradoxical, but I think very, very important.
Thank you all so much. This was such a good We have a 15-minute turnaround and then more of this. Take deep breaths. I'm exhausted from such wonderful discourse. Thank you.